live again on our monthly live series for how to fix democracy. Welcome back, everyone. And if you haven't been to one of our live events, welcome for the first time. We're thrilled to have you. This series is brought to you by the Bertelsmann Foundation of North America, Humanity in Action, and the Canadian Institute for Citizenship. I hope I got that one right. And we have a special fourth partner today, the John Adams Institute of Amsterdam. So we've really gone fully international. And we have Tracy Metz, John Adams' director, who I've known for many years, whose photo adorns Schiphol Airport for anyone arriving in Amsterdam. She is the unofficial queen of Holland and of Amsterdam. And I know that Tracy wants to say a few words before we introduce our main speaker today, Eliot Brown, the author of The Cult of We. So let me hand it over to you, Tracy. Just a couple of housekeeping notes. In terms of this conversation, we'll do about 45 minutes between Tracy, myself, and Eliot. And then we invite questions from the audience. You need to put your questions into the Q&A at the bottom of the frame. So over to you, Tracy.
Thank you, Andrew, for this spectacular introduction. I don't think I've ever been introduced before as the hidden queen of the Netherlands. Well, it is already a big honor to participate in this event. Many thanks to our friends at the Bertelsmann Foundation, and also, of course, to Andrew Keen, about which I'll say more in a moment. The John Adams Institute has been around for over 30 years now. We're an independent foundation whose mission is to bring the best and the brightest of American thinking to the Netherlands. And one of those American thinkers in 2018 was our own Andrew Keen, who came to talk about his book, How to Fix the Future. And before this event started, we've been doing a little bit of scheming on how to get him back to Amsterdam. For now, we are delighted to be one of the partners in this event. And I'm really looking forward to talking with Eliot Brown about WeWork, the spectacular rise, the spectacular fall. And the book is appearing on Tuesday. So we're all hoping that this event will get you all psyched up to go out and read everything there is to know about the strange and quixotic Adam Neumann, and Eliot knows more about that. So over to you, Andrew, to start the interview.
Thank you, Tracy, so much. Not only read the book, but of course, buy it. The Cult of We is out, as Tracy said, next week. And Eliot is a poor author, so we all need to spend our money on his new book. Eliot, welcome. The story so far on how to fix democracy is we're on to our third series. First series focused on the relationship between contemporary democracy and the rise of populist authoritarianism. Second series focused on the relationship between democracy and capitalism. And our third series is focusing on the we, on citizenship and democracy in the contemporary age and historically. So we're particularly thrilled to have Eliot Brown, the author of Cult of We, on the show. It's a book about WeWorks, but it's also, I think, a book more broadly about our contemporary culture's obsession, its fetishization of the idea of we. Eliot, is that fair? Your book is about WeWorks, its spectacular rise and fall and perhaps rise again today. But it's also a book about our obsession with the idea of we in a networked age of billion-dollar startups. Is that fair?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a story of how the country's most valuable startup was essentially this mirage. It was a tech company given this. It was a real estate company given this extraordinary valuation because people thought it was something different, something more than that. And a huge part of its story, its tale that it told investors, that its CEO told investors, was that it was essentially a physical social network. It was about this idea of community and would essentially take over the world as everyone enjoyed working next to each other, and it fostered bonds and synergy.
Tracy, I'm curious, what is the view of WeWorks from Europe? Do you guys just think of it as another crazy American startup, another version of Enron or some other slightly fraudulent enterprise?
No, WeWorks hasn't built a real estate empire here anywhere like it did in the US, but it's still been quite a presence in cities in Europe. And it was a culture that people wanted to belong to. So they have definitely spread that influence and that sense of community here. And I'm curious to hear from Eliot how this sense of community turned into a cult.
I think that's a great question. Eliot, over to you. Tracy assumes that the ideal of community got turned into a cult. How do you narrate this? How did Adam Neumann so successfully transform a good idea, the idea of citizenship and community, into a financial scheme for him in particular, to get rich so fast?
Yeah, so I think what happened essentially with WeWork is if you had actually, it was founded after the recession, the financial crisis in 2008. And it was initially founded on this idea of like, well, let's just have people working together in one space instead of leasing a bunch of expensive offices with big walls between them next to each other. And they can do it by the month instead of on 5-year terms. And so it sort of gradually became more of this idea of like, well, and these people like working with each other and maybe they can even do business with each other. And so if they had just sort of continued along that track and just grown organically, it wouldn't have gotten very big. It would have been really slow. I mean, there's sort of basic math at play. So what happened was the CEO and founder, Adam Neumann, just had this really big, almost messianic drive to him. And that's all he wanted. He wanted to be big and giant and take over the world. And so he ended up, over the ensuing 9 years, he ended up telling investors, the financial system, the right things that would get them to unlock enormous amounts of money for the company. And that involved things that were like that it wasn't like it being a tech company. As more and more money flowed in, the other thing that was going on was his own ego was growing. And so he really, I think, kind of lured people in by talking this game about how everything was about the we. And he would always say to employees, like, we need to put we over me. But then one of the ironies here is this is like the most selfish selfish guy I've ever covered. I mean, he really went to great lengths that I'm very cynical, and I would continually be surprised at the lengths to which he'd go to sort of gain personally at the expense of others. And he didn't really care about hurting others. That it was more that he wanted to gain for himself. And it's like, well, this is going to hurt the other shareholders. It's like, I don't care. I want it. It was, I guess, very personality driven. In the sense that, all cults are, we use that name a little bit tongue in cheek, but there's some reality to it too.
Should we be surprised though, Eliot? Sorry, and then come to Tracy. Should we be surprised? Mark Zuckerberg, for example, turned the social into a cult, made billions of dollars through that. I don't think there's anyone in the world less socially able, more socially awkward than Mark Zuckerberg. So should we be surprised that the person who turned the ideal of we into a cult should be an egoist, someone who is intensely selfish and me-ish?
No, not at all. I think this is less a story about Adam and more a story about what the Silicon Valley as an organism has decided it wants. And what's happened in the past 10 years is essentially just because of the myth of Steve Jobs. You have Silicon Valley financiers, venture capitalists, deciding that a huge, very important phenotype they're looking for is really egotistical, really visionary, loud, hard-charging founders. And so they essentially pre-select to get people who are messianic prone. And Peter Thiel's venture fund Founders Fund even says on its website that it looks for people who have near messianic qualities to be founders. So this is kind of baked into the system. And then the other thing that's a little more financial that's changed in the past 10 years is not only do they look for these founders like this, but then they give them control of the company, even though they own, can own 5%, 10% of the company. They have decided as sort of competitive capitalist dynamics to encourage just giving control to these people.
Tracy, over to you.
Yes, I was curious, Eliot, did Adam Neumann cooperate with you on this book?
No, I mean, when we say in the author's note, we go into this a little, like he had a PR person who did some fact checking with us. They didn't respond to everything we said, but we took some of their responses into account. But no, he didn't. He thought about it. We gave him plenty of options, wavered, and then ultimately didn't. I've talked with him before. I've been covering WeWork since 2013 for the Wall Street Journal. And so met him back then, and he was, much more excited. But sort of our coverage over time was covering them as a real estate company that happened to have an extremely high valuation, more like a tech company, and that wasn't really something that they really liked.
Eliot, what do you think the success of WeWorks, both in cultural and economic terms, tells us about the current state of American democracy? This longing for community, the way in which Adam Neumann manufactured enormous personal wealth through the cult of we. Does it speak of a vacuum, a lacunae at the heart of American democracy for citizenship? Does it speak of a longing, particularly for young people, for the ideals of we for citizenship?
I mean, I think that's definitely what helped give it legs early on. There was legitimately that was both good for demand for WeWork. I mean, they were getting a huge amount of people in these initial New York locations that really kind of wanted friends, that loved the idea of community near where they worked, around them. And that also clearly was something that really resonated with investors. I mean, investors, smart investors were calling this part of the sharing economy, when if you sort of know anything about the economics of the sharing economy businesses, Airbnb and Uber, it's actually a completely different business model. Like those latter two companies don't even lease or own any cars or homes. They just have other people do that and take a fee. WeWork would lease all its properties. But so investors really resonated with the community aspect. And I guess the part where that concept frayed was as they grew and grew and grew, as is sort of the desire of the venture capitalist crowd and the Silicon Valley crowd, and they kept doubling in size every year. The community aspect really just ended up being marketing. And they even did an internal study in 2017 because they had so much money. They had this whole research group. And so they did a sort of like academic style study where they did a survey, and they found that I think the headline for the study was, "Are our members friends?" And the answer was no, that people didn't have friends outside of their own business that they worked, even though the whole concept of this place was that everyone was becoming friends with each other and, cross-pollinating, and everyone was doing better as a result.
Eliot, one of our previous guests in series 3 was the very distinguished writer Margaret Atwood, of course, the author amongst many other books of The Handmaid's Tale, a dystopia of the we. Is there something dystopian, do you think, like The Handmaid's Tale about the story of Adam Neumann and WeWorks?
Oh my God, yes. No, it was all like, as it it kept growing and growing. It felt like an episode of Black Mirror. I mean, part of the issue is that, and I think this is actually very true, beyond just WeWork, but among these Silicon Valley companies, is you have particularly the employees who work at these companies get really into the mission-driven notion of the company, that what they are doing is doing good for the world, and they are making, I mean, it's a cliche, but they just would always say it, like, we are making the world a better place. And you can throughout Silicon Valley find companies that are doing ad tech, making ads more efficient, that are think that they're have a mission-driven culture. And so I think what you had there was you have 15,000 employees, or some large chunk of them, sort of convincing themselves and being convinced that I don't know, they were actually doing sort of good for society, and it's something I think is sort of inherent to recruiting at these tech companies and venture-backed companies.
Did the company connect what they were trying to do with democracy? Did Adam Neumann ever suggest that WeWorks was somehow enriching democracy, that they were adding something to politics which didn't previously exist?
In terms of like the actual, electoral democracy, that wasn't really his thing. It was more just like being good citizens of the world, on the political side of things, it was very sort of squishy. They'd sometimes be like, well, we need to be good citizens of the earth by banning meat. So no one can eat meat here except the CEO, who would then continue to eat meat. I guess they didn't ban meat. They just said you can't, WeWork can't pay for it. But no, I mean, so they didn't do much on electoral politics. It was more just like this idea of this sort of, post-state, postmodern idea of just like the corporation, the mission-driven corporation will be omnipotent throughout the world, or omnipresent throughout the world. And because our ideals are driving this, then we together as an organism are going to make the world a better place. So I guess that's sort of how they approach it. But that was the framework. It wasn't.
Right. And meanwhile, the economic truth of the WeWork's portfolio of investors was quite the reverse, made up of authoritarians like the new quote unquote enlightened despot of Saudi Arabia, and of SoftBank investing. Does WeWork speak of a particularly sort of creepy, anti-democratic, authoritarian supporting kind of global capitalism, Eliot?
So I would say that was, there is an undercurrent of that. The explicit way that Adam Neumann talked about it was kind of hard to pin down, but clearly by 2018, he had really lost, which was sort of the peak of Rome before the fall. He had really lost grip on reality. And so he would tell people things like, I need my valuation of WeWork to be the biggest on earth, because I want to be the person who people come to when countries start shooting at each other. Again, the CEO of a co-working company. But there was this desire to sort of be this, like he would talk about the Middle East, and because he's from Israel and sort of, had a lot of connection to the region. And he would talk to his staff about how we're going to play a role in Middle East peace. Like what's the role? Who knows? And then he clearly had some ambitions early on to be prime minister of Israel. And then as WeWork grew and his ego, got more out of control, he would tell people things that we still don't even know what to make of this, but he would say on multiple occasions, if I were to be anything, it would be president of the world. So I'm not quite sure what to do with that in terms of democracy. It wasn't Premier or czar of the world.
Yeah, Tracy, I'm dominating the conversation. Over to you.
That's fine. I was just amazed. I mean, this whole story has been so amazing. You think, how can people fall for this? But one of the things that I'm really happy I can ask you now, Eliot, is about Adam. He, as you mentioned, was not American. He was Israeli, but he really knew how to get to the soft spots behind the American carapace. He really knew how to manipulate people. And I'm so surprised that someone from a different culture could do that. It's a talent.
Totally. I mean, it's really kind of, je ne sais pas, it's hard to say exactly what he had, but when I first met him in 2013, he keeps me waiting for like 40 minutes. I'm like, where is this guy? And then, he comes in, he's just like full of energy, and he starts being really warm. And it's like, man, he really likes me. And like, he doesn't know me, but he made me feel it. And then he'd talk about, like, when we open up in Portland in 9 months, we'll be full within 2 weeks. And I would think like, wow, that's amazing. This business is doing great. And then I sort of left and thought about it. I was like, how could he know that? Like, he can't know that. But because he said it so confidently and sort of engaging way, he'd make people see things that I could never do to anyone, right? And like, that was really true with funders. So he was really good at that. But this is one of his talents, is just getting people to. I'd often say it's like he gets people to look at a pigeon and just tells them, no, it's a swan, and they actually like see the swan. And it mostly works when you're in the room with him, and it doesn't translate nearly as well over video or over email, or in newspaper stories. So another issue, and maybe one of the reasons why they imploded, was because he raised all this money sort of in person when he raised $10 billion. And then after that, he tried to go to public market investors who were more distant and just looking at WeWork's financials. And the energy, the magician quality didn't shine through.
Mhm.
Eliot, do you think that that Neumann has something in common with the charismatic authoritarians of the early 21st century, a Bibi Netanyahu, a Donald Trump, an Erdogan in Turkey, an Orban in Hungary, people who have somehow managed to seize the public imagination and in a broader public sense weave the kind of lies that that Adam Neumann did on a private level for WeWork?
Yeah, so I think that speaking a little more generally, like there is a certain character, and we see it a lot in Silicon Valley, we see it a lot in politics, of people who really rise up high, who are extremely narcissistic, often very insecure, and Adam was quite insecure, and just have like aiming at the moon for everything, and can say it in a convincing way, but are often kind of full of BS. That's a common thing out there in the world that I've observed. Adam was part of that, in terms of just like being exactly like, any of the politicians you mentioned. I don't know. I think it is a more general thing, but it clearly like works in society, right? Otherwise we wouldn't be seeing this.
I mean, there is a longing for that kind of certainty. We had Robert Putnam on our second series, the bowling alone guy. He has a new book, The Upswing, about a return to the communitarian values of the pre-Reagan America of the Great Society. What do you think the success of both Neumann and WeWork tells us about a longing to return to a more collective communitarian America or world?
I mean, it clearly plays well, and I think it also shows that you don't have to. Everything's about marketing, because if you look at Adam, I mean, he wasn't really preaching. He would often talk about how WeWork was exemplifying the values of the kibbutz, and he grew up in a kibbutz in Israel, and but then you look closely, and he'd also say, well, we're making a capitalist kibbutz, and it's like, that sounds really great, and then you're like, that's completely, I mean, it's just an oxymoron, right? Like, exactly. but if you deliver it well, then you can talk about these things and have people sort of not apply critical thinking and skim over complete contradictions inherent to what he's saying. So I mean, I think that's a pretty common theme, and that essentially was throughout the rise of WeWork, that everything about it was contradictory. I mean, again, like he would say, we over me. He literally named the company We, and then it was like all about me. It was all about him. He at one point said, I am WeWork. Yeah.
Tracy, have you had Robert Putnam at John Adams?
We have indeed had Robert Putnam at John Adams, and I'm hoping that he'll come back. We're hoping to start having live events again this fall, and I would love to have him return to the John Adams. Eliot, there was something else that I've always wondered about this amazing WeWork story. They're such an unlikely couple, the director of SoftBank and the director of WeWork, but Adam just wrapped this guy in his cocoon and got him to do whatever he wanted. What is your take on the relationship between these two extraordinary personalities?
Oh, it was so combustible. It's, I mean, and maybe taking one step back, there was sort of a third player, and all three of these had to align and meet each other, and they all essentially had the same qualities. So it's Adam Neumann, Masayoshi Son of SoftBank, and Mohammed bin Salman of Saudi Arabia, and the latter's role here was being the funder of SoftBank. So he had kind of, was ascendant in power in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and accumulating it while he was deputy crown prince. And he's like, I'm going to completely change our economy and take our oil wealth and plunge a large chunk of it into new industries. And like, he just happened to be really fascinated and taken by Silicon Valley and particularly startups. So he's like, I want to just give a ton of it to startups, which is not really the rational thing you do. You're like, maybe we should do this gradually and set up a whole strategy. But it was like, no, let's just give $45 billion to this guy who showed up. And so he gives him like the largest check ever written for a investment fund by many fold to Masayoshi Son. Masayoshi Son, who also really was desiring to be a huge player on the global stage, really like, eternal optimist and enormous appetite for risk, very egocentric as well, wanting to be the richest man in the world. He gets the money, and then he very quickly meets Adam and is like, well, here's $4 billion, the second largest check ever written for, a startup in the US. And so it's this kind of, we talk a lot about how the financial system created this and it's a structural thing, but it's also happens to be these three kind of egotistical guys with very big ambitions, all aligning together.
They weren't just guys, though, Adam. I mean, it's all very well picking on the guys, and three of them were clearly responsible. But Newman's wife, Rebecca, is, you talk about a trio. It's really a quartet. And Rebecca Neumann has a lot of responsibility in terms of the ideological underpinnings of We. Talk a little bit about her and her role in the narrative.
Totally. So, initially when Adam started a precursor to WeWork, it was the idea of we was not really there very much, and it was just about subleasing office space. And then he decided to start WeWork, and this is went a little after he'd married his now wife Rebecca Paltrow, Gwyneth Paltrow's first cousin, and she sort of added the we. She was really big into Kabbalah in New York, sort of Jewish mystical, thing. And she was, really pushing all sort of like the hokey phrases at WeWork about how they're elevating the world's consciousness. And they dedicated their IPO prospectus to the energy of we. These are things that she added. And so she was kind of always there, in the background and sometimes in the foreground, pushing WeWork in these more spiritual directions, the woo-woo directions. And, she really insisted that they start an elementary school midway through their rise, where, again, a co-working company, but they start a private elementary school that's $42,000 a year. Because she wasn't satisfied with education options for their children and thought that she should create something and then expand it to the whole world, and have it, their initial curriculum called for like yoga time and entrepreneurship teaching. This is for like literally 3-year-olds sometimes. So not something we normally see, at least in the public schools.
Eliot, I'm not sure if you're familiar with Dave Eggers' novel, The Circle, which is a dystopian take on Silicon Valley companies, very much like WeWork, a company of a cultish leader. And what Eggers' Circle does is collapse work and private life. So work becomes everything. That's something that Silicon Valley has been very skilled in taking away people's private lives, turning their campuses into both work and play places. And suggesting that work is everything and it can be a lot of fun. Was WeWork doing this on a broader scale? Because it always seemed to me that their marketing was premised on the idea that everyone wants to work all the time and everyone wants to be in a WeWork establishment.
Yes, that was actually like pretty central to, I mean, what Adam did was he took his views and what he sort of thought millennials wanted, which were what he did, even though he wasn't a millennial, and just, sort of impose them on the whole community and his membership. And so, yeah, he was, to his credit, somebody who worked extremely hard. Like he would work until 2 a.m. and then, get like 4 hours of sleep and be back working again. He did a lot of partying too, but he definitely worked a ton of hours. And so he just didn't see it. He would say this very explicitly, like, there is no boundary between work and play. And I think when particularly for their young staff, that was something that I don't know, people enjoyed it, but they did it and sort of thought that they believed it. Now, one of the tension points of running a 15,000 person company is eventually those people get older, have children, and are like, well, why am I being called into an executive meeting at literally 1 a.m.? And it was, not something that I think everyone loved, but yeah, I mean, they had signs up that would say hustle harder. They had a big thing called thank God it's Monday. It was this idea that work is play.
Is there a generational quality here, Eliot? You're younger than I am, but you're probably not part of the millennial or the
borderline
yeah, you're kind of, I get confused with all these different generations. But whereas perhaps my generation idealized politics and citizenship in terms of activism, the younger generation seems obsessed with cryptocurrency and startups like WeWorks. Has technology and the idea of making it rich and doing good simultaneously, has that become the sort of the mythology, the drug, if you like, of a younger generation?
I think so. I mean, we'll see where things develop, because I think we're still sort of in a transition period for how the public perceives big tech. But, a few years ago, when Facebook was just a sort of quirky company that was expanding quickly, I mean, you had people there really thinking they were, and at Twitter really thinking they were helping the world by democratizing information and making the world a better place by fostering connections. And they're like, look, we can, Tahrir Square is our doing. And then, a year and a half later, the same two platforms essentially create ISIS, right? Like, and domestic terrorism now. And Mark Zuckerberg gave a speech in 2008 about how he was going to, I think it was 2008, about how Facebook was going to like get rid of terrorism because it was going to enlighten, disaffected youths in the Arab world. There's this more recently. I mean, one of the funniest ones to me, or scariest, I guess, was Juul, the vaping nicotine delivery startup, and people there really were convinced that they were doing good for the world because they were on a mission to take people off of smoking cigarettes and put them into something that was presumably more safe. But how could you have been sitting there for so long and then just seeing these like melon flavored things roll out and seeing them spike in sales near middle schools, and just how can you have that dissonance? But I think what society today, particularly Silicon Valley culture today, breeds is it encourages people to only see the like I'm helping the world side of these things, and to be able to ignore the externalities.
All right, and John Adams tells the truth. Tracy, over to you. I'm sure you've got another very sharp question for Eliot.
Oh, I do. I'm so happy to have this opportunity to ask them all the things I've wondered about during this whole saga. Adam really cashed when WeWorks decided that they had to get rid of him. What is he doing now?
So yes, he's become, one of the funny things about the story is the company has lost a collective like $11 billion over the years, but he has left with well over $1 billion in cash and stock. What? And so, TBD, he's sort of like yearning to get back in the game in some form. But you
just had a piece in the Journal, Eliot, about him buying a $40 million Miami condo property.
Yes, so he bought a extremely expensive house in a state with no capital gains tax soon after having what stands to be a very large capital gains bill. He sold a ton of stock. He's investing in real estate startups. He's trying to invest in lots of real estate startups. He's been telling people he wants to do something, or had been telling people he wants to do something on the future of living. But that was months ago. I don't know if that's sort of come and gone. So we haven't heard anything all that specific. He's been buying apartment buildings. I mean, he clearly wants to do, he really believes in sort of startups still and wants to do something there generally, but unclear exactly what it's going to be. But he is not lacking for money.
And that's the astonishing thing, I think, about your story is, had you been writing a book about Enron, you would have ended your final chapter with half the people from Enron maybe being in jail or should be being in jail and the company completely bankrupted. But the particularly chilling thing, I think, about the WeWork story is you've written a book about the rise and fall of WeWorks, but it's rising again. There's a SPAC, a publicly listed vehicle for WeWorks going public. The SoftBank guys are back in charge, making fortunes off it, and many other companies. Neumann has survived, as you say, he's prospering. He's not going to jail. Leaving aside the personal stuff about Neumann, are you concerned that this kind of gangster-style capitalism is become almost impossible to control? And as a second part of the question, can Biden stand up to Silicon Valley? And is some of the things he's doing now going to be ultimately helpful in controlling this kind of gangster capitalism?
So I'd say both of these questions are a little outside of my wheelhouse. Like I don't focus as much on the policy, but with startups generally, I mean, and sort of where a lot of this money is flowing in, like to SPACs right now. Well, let me break that down in two ways. In terms of private.
And you might explain a SPAC very briefly, sure. Eliot, because that's the mechanism through which WeWorks now is trying to go public and raise more money.
Sure. So yeah, I guess broadly here. So, when WeWork was a product of the private startup market being a bubble and way too much money going in there. And that was sort of the apotheosis of that mini era. Now money has shifted to companies that are going public, but through a different means than normal. So normally you do an IPO. Right now it's something called a SPAC, where essentially people just investors fund a company that sits on the stock exchange that has no assets, but that company looks for a private company to merge with. And why would you do that? It's just a way to get around the regulatory process of the IPO. So as a very long answer to your question, that is a very bubbly market right now, where we see lots of startups and electric vehicle companies with no revenue, with kind of wild corporate governance going public. And that is something where the government can pretty easily step in. And the signs are that they are thinking of doing something. They're certainly thinking of doing something there. It would be the SEC, and it could be something big. It could be something small. We don't really know. But that is a regulatory question. If you want that to sort of keep happening, will money stop flowing into crazy areas? Like, no, that's happened ever since we had tulips in the Netherlands. This has been going on forever. You can do things to plug holes. You can, after Enron happens, you can add a bunch of rules to make more reporting in the public markets, but then it just goes to the private markets. So it's a bit of game of whack-a-mole.
Tracy, before we open up the questions to the audience, what's the view currently of post-Trump America from Europe? Is Biden a return to sanity? Do you have more faith now in American democracy, or do you still see it as in a state of real crisis?
People, I think, here generally are relieved. Then again, as in the US itself, everyone realizes that Biden probably only has until the midterms to really make a difference. His majority in the Senate is so tiny, namely the vice president, that the risk that he will lose the Senate in the midterms is enormous. So people are sort of holding back and waiting on their judgment to see whether this will actually stick. But there is huge relief that there is an international conversation going again, that it's less truculent, less angry, that there is more belief in partnership and working together. So carefully, yes. And
Eliot, do you think that America is learning from Europe in terms of controlling big tech? After all, many of the initiatives in America have been inspired by EU regulators like Margrethe Vestager.
Yeah, I mean, again, it's out of my wheelhouse, but my sense is, yes, like a few years ago, nobody really knew, like, how do we control a platform, and what should we do? And so then, as like a few, bean counters in the Capitol and on committee staff of Democrats were thinking about that, Europe actually did stuff. So there was clearly a template in a way that there was not 3 years ago.
Nate, let's open it up. I know there are a lot of questions for Eliot, and perhaps which you always do such a good job bundling these questions, and I know there's a number.
Sure. First off, thanks for everyone for joining us today. Really interesting discussion, and keep the questions coming. We should have time for even more than we have already in the queue. For starters, we had a question here. 2 questions about WeWork. One, did you get the feeling, Eliot, that Neumann understood at some level that his persona and profile were manufactured, and that maintaining this facade was essential to the success of the venture? And then second, where was the due diligence of WeWork when Adam Neumann brought his wife into the picture, and even more after Adam was replaced by 2 CEOs who gave themselves huge severance packages? So maybe just going deeper into WeWork to kick us off here.
Sure. So yeah, on the question of sort of, was Adam talking a game? Did he know it was a Potemkin village? The conclusion we come to is he would drink his own Kool-Aid. I mean, he would very easily convince himself of things in the same way that, I think basically this is the cartoonish version in my head and speculative, but what happened was he started this thing and had this idea of we, and then saw people moving together. And then people are like, well, social networks are really in, and venture capitalists like funding them. He's like, that's exactly what I have. It's a social network. And then, suddenly the sharing economy becomes big. And he's like, no, it's the sharing economy. That's exactly what we do. So, and then I think he'd actually then believe it. He would often tell this anecdote about how he met his wife, and within like a minute, she told him on their first date, "You are full of shit." And the moral of the story was, no, I ended up in the end like learning to be real in life. But I think there was a lot of him being full of shit throughout life, and he sort of always telling these stories that like, you really believe these? That said, he really did, actually think he was going to be, a trillionaire and run this multi-trillion-dollar company, and on half of it, his head was in the clouds. And so in terms of the due diligence side of things, one of the issues here is there was no corporate governance. I mean, corporate governance here was a total dumpster fire. And, particularly after Enron, there's been a lot of moves over the past 2 decades to take American corporations and make the way they govern themselves a little more sanitary it's a debatable issue, but at least like there's more disclosure around things like jets, there's more disclosure around pay. And Adam just, was going the complete other way in all sorts of crazy ways, much more so than even the normal Silicon Valley companies. And so, his wife worked there. He had rampant nepotism, like 3 board members ended up having kids who worked there. He had huge numbers of family members who worked there. He was taking out money. He restructured the entire company in order to give himself a better tax benefit on his stock options. I mean, literally, like completely changed how it went, like the corporate structure changed so he could benefit from taxes. He was leasing properties to the company. So, I mean, it was just the type of thing where the investors who were on the board, first of all, Adam controlled the board, but they could have voted no, but they didn't, because it was kind of the frog in water. It's like, well, my investment's doing really well, and the money keeps going up, and I try to tell him, and it's not that bad, it could be worse, and sure. So it's it obviously didn't end in a very ideal way.
But Adam, you preface your epilogue in the book with a quote from Fitzgerald's Great Gatsby, famous quote from the book. We don't remember Gatsby really anymore. Obviously, he was a fictional person. But we remember that kind of society. I wonder in future, we're not probably going to remember Adam Neumann, but we are going to remember the society that generated, that fed and idolized an Adam Neumann, won't we?
To be determined. I mean, yeah, like I thought when we were writing the book, thought this was going to sort of be the bookend to this era of Silicon Valley startup insanity, where all these founders are fetishized. But it ends up, things sort of turned around and sped up again. So I don't know. We'll see how long the era goes. But yeah, I mean, to me, it seems pretty kind of aberrant compared to what we've seen in the past. On the other hand, maybe this is the new normal. I mean, you look at all these companies going public and they all, like the CEOs, really have a lot of power, even though they own a minority of the shares.
And meanwhile, some of these cultish leaders like Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos are now sort of stepping into the public realm, launching initiatives to go into space. So it's a particularly troubling period, isn't it, in terms of this challenge to the public and the way in which private companies are essentially colonizing the public realm for their own benefit?
I think what's, and this is probably broader than Silicon Valley, but Silicon Valley is where the wealth is accumulating. But there's definitely a sense there among the plutocrat crowd that, they determine what's good for the world. They determine what charity is. And they actually don't even sort of often see lines between a nonprofit and a for-profit. They think that funding startups that do good for the world is better than giving to some nonprofit. So yeah, I mean, that seems to be where things are headed. They all certainly have a lot of money to do that too, as it happens. So, if trends continue, it'll be a ton of money.
Tracy, jump in if you want whenever, but Nate, perhaps you can throw out some more questions too.
Okay, I do have a question before we continue, Eliot. I was really curious, why did you decide to publish now? Because as Andrew mentioned at the beginning, WeWork seems to be on its way back up. It's very topical, but at the same time, the story is long from over.
Yeah, I mean, part of it is that book publishing takes a while, so we would have preferred to publish earlier. So I think we certainly when we started, we thought it was like really the coda to an era. And then for the first 6 months after that, it really did seem to be. And suddenly founders were on their back feet in Silicon Valley, and venture capitalists were getting all introspective and talking about how they wanted to have more control. And then companies, it became really hard for a lot of private companies to raise money. And so things were chilling. And so we thought it was just the punctuation on this era. We were pretty far along in writing the book at that point. And then COVID happened, and then the opposite happened, and everything went crazy again. Which was the complete opposite of what we expected when COVID started. We're like, well, here's a thing that is really bad for a shared office, a communal office company, one without much money. But they've managed to weather it. And so, yeah, now there's a sort of question mark on what will happen in the future. But I mean, I think WeWork today is really, it's a real estate company, not one many people would write a book about. The funny thing, the lesson to society here that we thought was worth imparting was like, here's how a real estate company got treated as this life-changing, elevating consciousness company that was worth 47 billion.
Nate, more questions, because I know we have a lot.
Yeah, I have to say, though, the conversation has done a great job of predicting what people wanted to hear, because some of these, like his President of the World statement and the influence of the kibbutz have been covered early in the conversation. So that's a good sign. I do have one more here that popped up, going deeper into the Adam Neumann's kind of persona at WeWork. And how did he deal with any adversaries and enemies in WeWork, people who maybe saw through his facade?
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple of answers to that. So on the funding side, one of the interesting things about the private market compared to the public market is when you're trading, your stock's trading on the public market is essentially people voting. And if people all like your stock, then the price goes up and that's your value. And if a lot of people don't like it and start to sell, then the value goes down. In the private markets, when you're fundraising and you do it at a given valuation, all you need is one person to agree to that. So if I have $1 billion company and I raise $10 million, I just need that one person to give me the 10 million at this valuation. So, it was the type of thing where he would, if people didn't like him, it didn't matter. If 9 out of 10 people said, oh, that's a company worth 0, that was irrelevant so long as he found the 1 out of 10 to make him worth 1 billion. And that's actually exactly what happened. Like he went on this fundraising trip in China and had Goldman Sachs go scan all of China for people interested in funding. And, you know, all of them came back either with like, I'm not interested, or maybe this is worth 10 billion. And then he found one who was like, yeah, 16 billion sounds good to me. And that was it. WeWork was a $16 billion company. So, you know, part of it is like, you just keep talking to people until you get the right answer. And then, you know, the other part was the press. Like, I was a bit of a lone voice of Cassandra here, I guess, in that at the Journal, we were publishing pretty skeptical things about them, meaning just pointing out that they're a real estate company with this huge valuation that doesn't seem justified. And, you know, they were really nice to me at first. Adam would have me in. And then as we kept writing more of those stories, it just like sort of cut me out and would, you know, have the press people sort of scream at me. You know, there was a little bit of bullying, but in the scheme of things, wasn't much. Like there weren't private detectives I noticed following me home, or you know, didn't get hate mail written with letters from magazines. Like I guess the really broad answer is it was a really big ocean, and if you find the believers, that's all you really need, particularly in the private market. And so you can just ignore the haters.
Nate, more questions?
Yeah, I've got a couple here about this kind of sense of community, and perhaps this is something that there's a void that WeWork perhaps filled for a bit. Are people interested in these community-driven companies because there's weak social cohesion in the United States? Is there a connection there? And then second, is WeWork kind of the ultimate expression of quote unquote Silicon Valley bro culture, where there's this need to be inside of a really exclusive club?
Maybe doing them in reverse. The latter, you know, something close to it. You know, they had all these like kitschy slogans like "hustle harder" everywhere, and you know, there were definitely people who worked there would say like it was kind of littered with bros. So in that sense, they really hit it on the nose. Adam, just like his vision of fun and community was drinking. And having lots of fun. So, you know, like that would really spill through to the culture. And sorry, I forgot the first part of the question.
Yeah, the first one was, are these community-driven companies or mission-driven companies attractive because there's a lack of like direction and social cohesion?
Yeah, one of the things that I have trouble knowing the answer to is how real is that on the demand side of these companies versus how much is it that these companies are telling that story to themselves. And there's a number of different reasons they do that. So the best example I think is Airbnb. So you know, if you look at the rhetoric from the CEO there, it is solely a company about having neighbors know each other and communities working. And like, you know, the CEO there, Brian Chesky, he actually, unlike Adam, is not like the most selfish person on the planet, and is not just like he's agreed to give a huge amount of his compensation away. Like I think he does believe a lot of that stuff, but then if you talk to anyone I know who's been in an Airbnb and you look at surveys, like people don't want to meet the host, like they just want a place to stay. So I'm sure there's some people that enjoy getting to know their host, but like, it's sort of like Lyft. Lyft started where you would go in and you'd sit in the front of the car and you'd give a fist bump to your driver. And they thought like, look at how we're going to create community. And it's like, okay, well, what was the reality that resulted? People didn't want to do a fist bump to their driver. They wanted to sit in the back and put their earphones in. Certainly it's helpful for recruiting because you need to convince these people that they're not just here as a financial instrument to make a co-working company that's really valuable. And then it seems like it really resonates with investors. How much of it resonates with the actual users of these products? Some. I really still puzzle over just how much.
Tracy, do you have any follow-ups on anything?
I do indeed, exactly to this point. Thank you, Andrew, for giving me the opportunity to ask. I was curious, Eliot, was there a difference in drinking the Kool-Aid between the people who actually worked for the company, those 15,000, and all those many, many, many more people who actually rented the space? They had to buy into this philosophy to a certain extent as well. Otherwise, they would have gone elsewhere. Was there a difference in culture, or was it drag along, tag along?
Yeah, I think that for the bulk of the members, the people paying to be there, they were there because they wanted an office, and this was like a good, nice, well-designed, usually well-run, but not always, office. And the community benefit was like, to the extent that it was there, it was marginal. I think it was something that employees liked, but not. You didn't see companies paying 4 times as much to go to a WeWork as a competitor that didn't emphasize community. You saw them paying the same amount. And so that suggests that the community was didn't have all that much value to it. And yeah, they had a study internally that found that people weren't friends. And then actually a huge amount of WeWork's growth toward the end, and now it's about 50%, is what they call enterprise, where they literally just rent out floors of buildings solely to a company. And so the company isn't even part of the community physically. And so like it's quite clear that was not really at the end that much of the demand side. On the employee side, yeah, like I think you talk to at least the executives, and they really continued to think that they were driving community everywhere, and they're creating community, and like people like, these 23-year-olds would get really excited about making events and like cutting out cool cucumber water or fruit water with cool designs in it, saying fun things. So they got really into it. I don't think they were completely brainwashed. They had like people that enjoyed it, but no, like it was, they were running a real estate business at the end of the day.
I think we've got time for one more series of questions, Nate.
Yeah, what is the role of journalism in holding these companies and leaders of these companies accountable? Maybe as a final point here, since we're here because of some great journalism. Yeah.
I have thoughts on this one. Yeah, like I think so. Private companies are hard. They don't report their finances. They often lie, as was the case with WeWork. They throw around terms like profit when they have none of it, and because of that, there's what they sort of their nectar is hype. And vision, portraying success, and that's how they get more funding. That's how they get more press. That's how they get more employees. And so, to the extent we can, our job, I think, is to bring reality, to keep us grounded in reality. So it is not easy, and like one of the things that personally got me motivated to move to San Francisco to cover this stuff was, reading essentially the tech press, the Forbes, TechCrunch, Fast Company, in sort of the headiest moment of this era in 2015. And all of it was just lionizing these startups for disrupting these, tired companies. And no one was doing sort of critical thinking that I could do with a single econ course from college under my belt, where it's like, well, you're paying $4 to go in a car across San Francisco. The driver gets paid and manages to feed himself. How are they not losing lots of money on this? There was this one company called Ship, SHYP, that would like come to your door and pick up packages and box them for you, do like 40 hours of labor, and you'd pay them $5 essentially for the experience. It's like, what? So journalism, I think, should not, certainly foremost, be to not just buy the narrative and the story, the fairy tale that they paint as their vision to venture capitalists, because that's what it is. It's a vision. It's like, this is what we're gonna do, not what we're doing now. We're losing money on a product now. So it's to sort of bring reality there, and then to sort of like call companies out when you can see or with good evidence suppose that they are really escaping gravity. And it happens all the time. I mean, this is why bubbles happen, but like it's our job to not get rose colored and be cynical sometimes, and dig into companies to the extent you can, to bring reality to bear. And like, that doesn't always, people don't like that. It's not always that easy. It's not terribly like clear cut that like, well, WeWork is it just happened that WeWork was incredibly obviously a real estate company. It was very easy to show that. With Uber, who knew if it was going to be a success or not? And there's a bit of a gray area. Yeah, so I think it's at least to not get caught in the sort of the story and fairy tale, and to be like, they lose money today, maybe they'll make it in the future.
Well, that's exactly, Eliot Brown, what you've done as a journalist, as a good professional, one of America's leading financial real estate journalists, to write this wonderful book, The Cult of We, which tells the truth, I think, about WeWork, a unique, or seemingly, maybe troublingly not unique company coming out of Silicon Valley, built on lies and mythology. I want to thank you very much for a wonderful conversation about citizenship, or perhaps the lack of citizenship in an increasingly digitally networked world. And I want to leave it with Tracy for some final comments. Tracy, thank you so much for appearing, and thanks so much to the John Adams Institute of Amsterdam for co-hosting and co-sponsoring this event. So let me hand it over to you, Tracy, to sign out.
Okay, thank you, Andrew, and thank you especially, Eliot, for writing this book and for being with us to talk about it. Thank you to the Bertelsmann Foundation, with whom we are so happy to work together. You do such great stuff. It's so important. And I hope that you will all be inspired to follow the activities of the John Adams at www.john-adams.nl. And we are looking forward to live events this fall again, including Patrick Radden Keefe, who wrote a book about the opioid crisis called The Empire of Pain, about the Sackler family. So that promises to be interesting, about yet another crisis that has plagued American society for years now. Eliot, congratulations on your book. Good luck on Tuesday when it actually appears, and I hope it's a bestseller.
Thank you so much for having me. This has been great.
It was a pleasure. Thank you.